Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we begin with a coffin that arrived in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Inside lies the body of a man who never carried a weapon, never commanded an army, but whose words online reached hundreds of thousands across West Africa. His name was Ibrahim Traoré, known to his followers as Alino Faso. On July 24, 2025, while held in an Ivorian gendarmerie facility in Abidjan, Alino was declared dead. Prosecutors in Côte d'Ivoire said he had taken his own life, first cutting his wrists, then using bedsheets to hang himself. But in Burkina Faso, that explanation landed like a hammer on stone. Officials rejected it outright, calling it an assassination carried out in secrecy. And when his coffin was finally sent back weeks later, the streets of Ouagadougou erupted in grief and fury. But who was this man? Alino was not a general, not a minister. He was a voice, a 30-something activist who used Facebook and other platforms to amplify a simple message. Burkina Faso must stand free from foreign domination, and Africa must speak in its own voice. In a country where more than 2 million people have been displaced by conflict, he gave encouragement, live streams of solidarity, and sharp critiques of leaders he saw as serving outside interests. His following grew beyond 400,000 online. For many, he was a brother, a patriot, a bridge between the ordinary citizen and the president himself. Now he is gone. His family received no early warning. His supporters learned of his death through rumors online before official confirmation. His body returned home, but no clear answers. For the Burkinabe public, this was not only disrespect, it was humiliation. And humiliation, in this part of the world, rarely passes quietly. As the coffin was carried through the capital, mothers wailed, youth marched with fists in the air, veterans stood in salute. His name was shouted like thunder, "Alino, Alino!" In their eyes, he was not just a blogger, but a martyr for sovereignty. And so we ask tonight, was this the suicide of a man broken by detention, or the silencing of a voice too powerful to be left alive? More than that, could this single death ignite a fire that spreads across borders, across governments, across the very map of West Africa? Stay with us, because Alino Faso's story is only beginning. To understand why Alino Faso's death has shaken 2 nations, we need to retrace the chain of events that brought us here. It began in January 2025, when Alino traveled to Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire's economic capital. Officially, he was visiting friends and attending meetings with Burkinabe communities living there. But within days, he was arrested by Ivorian authorities. The charges? Collusion with foreign powers, spreading destabilizing propaganda, and threatening state security. His supporters back home immediately called it political persecution. To them, Alino's real crime was simple. He supported President Ibrahim Traoré openly and denounced French influence in West Africa. Instead of being sent to a regular prison, Alino was transferred to a tightly guarded military gendarmerie compound. For 6 months, there were no family visits, no access for Burkinabe diplomats, only silence. His followers noticed that his social media pages froze. The man who once posted daily updates to hundreds of thousands had gone dark. Questions mounted, but answers never came. Then came July 24, 2025. In the early morning hours, Ivorian prosecutors announced that Alino had been found dead in his cell. The official account was chillingly detailed. First, he attempted to cut his wrists. When that failed, he tied sheets from his bed around his neck and hanged himself. But the Burkinabe government quickly rejected this version. Officials asked, if it was suicide, why had they denied every request for visits? Why did the news leak on social media before the family was informed? Why was his death declared online with no immediate access to the body? For many Burkinabe citizens, the suicide story was impossible to believe. They remembered Alino as a man of conviction, someone who lifted spirits even in hardship. To them, he would not abandon his mission so suddenly. Suspicion grew that this was not suicide, but silencing. The pressure built. President Traoré issued a 48-hour ultimatum to the Ivorian government. Explain what happened, release the body, or face consequences. Abidjan did not respond with clarity. They stood by the suicide account, rejected accusations of mistreatment, and delayed the release of the remains. Weeks passed. Finally, in mid-August, Alino's coffin was flown to Ouagadougou. But as many pointed out, the body came without answers. Burkinabe officials ordered an independent autopsy to be carried out at home. Yet for the public, the damage was done. A symbol had been born. One woman's story captures the mood. Her name is Mariam, a market vendor in Ouagadougou. She never met Alino personally, but she followed him online. She says she tuned into his live streams at night after selling vegetables, listening to his words about dignity and sovereignty. When she heard of his death, she joined thousands in the capital, carrying a small picture of him on cardboard. Through tears, she told a local journalist, "They took Thomas Sankara from us in 1987. Now they've taken Alino, but this time, we will not let them win." That comparison mattered. By invoking Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated decades earlier, many Burkinabe were connecting Alino to a long line of figures seen as martyrs for independence. His death tapped into deep historical memory. The demonstrations swelled. Flags waved, chants thundered. Outside the Ivorian embassy, protesters burned flags and painted graffiti, "Justice for Alino," and "Ouattara is France's governor." Artists released protest songs. Radio stations replayed Alino's old audio clips calling for unity. Even football clubs observed moments of silence before games. For the government in Ouagadougou, this was more than grief. It was a national test. Traoré's administration declared that Alino's story would not end in silence. Plans were announced to build a national monument in his honor and to mark July 24th each year as a national day of remembrance. Schools would teach his story to the next generation. Meanwhile, border measures tightened. Troops were seen inspecting vehicles entering from Côte d'Ivoire. Civil society groups in Mali, Niger, and Guinea held solidarity rallies, echoing Burkina Faso's anger. Across Africa, hashtags like Siao, Justice for Alino, and Das Africa Wake spread rapidly. But beneath the grief and the slogans, a larger question was forming. Who ordered Alino's arrest, and who benefited from his death? Some suspected the Ivorian government acted on its own to contain dissent. Others believed foreign powers were involved, pointing to France's long-standing influence in Abidjan. No evidence has been presented publicly, but the suspicions refuse to fade. The death of Alino Faso has become more than a personal tragedy. It is now a mirror reflecting the fractures of West Africa, between governments and their people, between sovereignty and outside influence, between the official story and the truth that many believe has been buried with him. As his coffin rests in Ouagadougou, one question remains louder than all the chants in the streets. Will Alino's death be remembered as an isolated tragedy, or the beginning of a movement that redraws political lines across West Africa? The return of Alino Faso's body was not the end of the story. It was the spark that turned grief into fury, silence into thunder. When the coffin arrived in Ouagadougou, the capital erupted. Entire neighborhoods poured into the streets. Mothers in white cloth wailed aloud. Youths, fists raised high, chanted his name as if to call him back. "Alino! Alino!" Veterans marched alongside them, saluting a man they saw as a patriot, even though he had never worn a uniform. In Bobo Dioulasso, the nation's second city, traditional elders held a funeral ceremony, pouring libations to the ancestors and declaring that Alino's spirit would now protect Burkina Faso's youth. The anger was palpable. To many, the delivery of a coffin without an explanation was not just an insult, it was a provocation. Graffiti began to appear on walls across Ouagadougou. "No peace without justice. France's governor, Alino's blood cries out." Protest songs flooded radio stations, mixing hip-hop beats with traditional drums, echoing through marketplaces and cafes. In his most fiery address yet, President Ibrahim Traoré gave voice to the rage of his people. Standing before cameras, he declared, "This is not just about one man's death. This is about sovereignty. This is about dignity. Burkina Faso will not swallow humiliation. If answers are denied, consequences will follow." His words electrified the nation. Within hours, thousands gathered outside the Ivorian embassy. Flags were burned. Walls were defaced with slogans accusing President Alassane Ouattara of serving foreign masters instead of African unity. The embassy became a fortress under siege, ringed by police, as protesters vowed not to leave until justice was given. Meanwhile, at the borders, Burkinabe soldiers intensified their presence. Every vehicle from Côte d'Ivoire was checked. Travelers described long lines and tense faces. For the first time, many felt the possibility of two West African neighbors sliding from diplomacy into open confrontation. But the reaction was not limited to Burkina Faso. Across the Sahel, solidarity spread like wildfire. In Mali, activists projected Alino's face onto the walls of Bamako University. In Niamey, Niger, students marched carrying both Burkinabe and national flags, chanting, "Africa will not bow." In Guinea, a popular rapper released a track titled "Voice of Alino," which quickly went viral. Even in the diaspora, Paris, Brussels, Washington, vigils were held, candles flickering beneath banners demanding truth. The symbolism was undeniable. Alino had become a martyr for a broader African struggle. His death had merged with the memory of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader killed in 1987. Chants at protests often paired their names together. Sankara, Alino, we continue your fight. For older Burkinabe, this was hauntingly familiar. For the younger generation, it was a rallying cry. But while the people roared, the Ivorian government remained almost silent. Abidjan repeated its claim of suicide, provided no apology, no condolences, and launched no transparent investigation. This silence, cold and dismissive, only deepened the fury. Inside Côte d'Ivoire itself, the crisis was not ignored. Opposition politicians accused President Ouattara of mishandling the situation and jeopardizing national stability. Rumors swirled that his government had bowed to French pressure, fueling suspicion across the region. Meanwhile, international observers struggled to keep up. Western media gave the story little attention at first, but African social networks kept it alive. Hashtags like Yachar Justice for Alino trended for days. Telegram groups circulated speeches, videos, and songs in his honor. Analysts noted that Alino's death had done what no diplomatic summit had managed in years. It united voices across borders. For ordinary families in Burkina Faso, the impact was personal. A seamstress named Sarah explained to reporters, "I never knew him, but he spoke for us. He said we could stand without begging. Now they've silenced him. If we stay quiet, they will silence us all." The emotional climax came during Alino's funeral procession in Ouagadougou. Tens of thousands lined the streets as the coffin draped in the national flag passed by. Religious leaders from both mosques and churches stood together, calling for unity and truth. A choir of children sang an old revolutionary song, their small voices rising above the drums. It was more than mourning, it was defiance. The people were not asking to calm down. They were demanding clarity, accountability, and dignity. And through it all, one truth became clear. Alino Faso had been transformed from a social media activist into a symbol of an entire movement. But symbols alone do not resolve conflicts. As tension mounted, one question loomed over the region. Would this fury remain a people's cry for justice, or would it tip West Africa into a dangerous confrontation between nations? The death of Alino Faso did not only ignite protests, it also began reshaping the very fabric of Burkinabe society. At the civil level, the impact was immediate. Teachers in Ouagadougou reported classrooms half empty as students joined marches. Women's associations, usually focused on food distribution or child welfare, stepped into the streets carrying placards. Retired soldiers who had once fought in counterinsurgency operations now marched side by side with students. In neighborhoods across the capital, walls became canvases of resistance, murals of Alino's face painted beside slogans like "Truth is freedom" and "Justice for Alino." Markets felt the tension too. Traders who once worried only about grain prices now spoke about sovereignty and betrayal. Miriam, the vegetable seller who followed Alino's live streams, told a reporter that she closed her stall for 3 days to join vigils. "Food can wait," she said. "Dignity cannot." Politically, the stakes grew higher by the hour. The government of President Ibrahim Traoré positioned itself firmly alongside the people, framing Alino's death as not just a personal tragedy, but a national wound. Ministers of Information and Justice repeated on television, this was not suicide, this was execution. Parliamentarians held emergency sessions, debating whether Burkina Faso should cut diplomatic ties with Côte d'Ivoire altogether. 3 measures were soon announced: the recall of Burkina Faso's ambassador from Abidjan, the freezing of official diplomatic contacts until an international inquiry was launched, the creation of a Pan-African legal committee to prepare charges of human rights violations against Côte d'Ivoire. Each measure sent ripples far beyond Ouagadougou. In the African Union, whispers began about convening an urgent session. In ECOWAS, already strained after Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger withdrew earlier that year, the silence was deafening. For many Burkinabe, that silence was proof that old regional structures were unwilling to defend African voices against foreign-aligned governments. The civil mood hardened. Crowds outside the Ivorian embassy swelled into the tens of thousands. Radio call-in shows brimmed with emotion, callers accusing Ouattara of betraying Africa, of being a governor for France. Religious leaders across mosques and churches jointly called for truth, warning that if leaders ignored this demand, the people themselves will seek justice. The human dimension remained central. Families who had lost children in years of conflict with extremist groups saw in Alino's death another form of injustice. One father in Kaya, a town north of Ouagadougou, told a local station, "My son died fighting terrorists. Alino died fighting words, but both died because someone wanted our nation silent." As emotions soared, the government declared that July 24th would become a national day of remembrance. Plans were unveiled for a monument in Ouagadougou with Alino's words engraved, "A nation is only free when its people refuse to bow." Schools were instructed to include his story in civic lessons, ensuring that his name would not fade with the protests. The political cost to Côte d'Ivoire deepened. Opposition leaders in Abidjan began criticizing Ouattara for isolating the country. Civil society in Côte d'Ivoire itself grew uneasy, questioning whether their government's silence had invited instability. Regional trade, especially the flow of goods across the southern Burkina Faso border, slowed as inspections multiplied. Truck drivers reported delays stretching into days. What had begun as a detention now threatened to disrupt livelihoods across West Africa's busiest corridors. International reactions were mixed. France issued a cautious statement supporting Côte d'Ivoire's account. The United States expressed concern and urged restraint. But across African capitals, youth movements staged solidarity events, turning Alino into a continental figure. In Bamako, a banner stretched across a university gate read, "An injury to Burkina is an injury to us all." This civil and political convergence, people on the streets, government standing behind them, regional solidarity emerging, created an unusual alignment. Rarely in recent African history had state and citizen marched in such lockstep. For President Traoré, it was both an opportunity and a burden. Opportunity to rally a nation, burden to act on promises of justice. Yet the risk was clear. When governments harden their stance and people grow impatient, diplomacy can collapse into confrontation. Already, border soldiers faced one another across tense checkpoints. Already, families with ties on both sides of the frontier whispered of the fear that trade could halt completely. And above all, a haunting question rose among Burkina Faso citizens. If one man's voice could be silenced this way, what would stop the same fate from befalling others? Burkina Faso's streets are alive with anger, its politics aflame with resolve. But how long can this fragile unity hold before the weight of grief and fury tips the region from protest to peril? From Washington to Paris, the death of Alino Faso has raised questions that go far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. In the United States, lawmakers on Capitol Hill have begun to ask uncomfortable questions. At a recent subcommittee hearing, one congressman asked bluntly, "If America continues to support regimes accused of silencing activists, are we protecting stability or fueling instability?" For older Americans who remember Cold War politics, the debate feels familiar. Short-term alliances clashing with long-term ideals. U.S. officials officially called for restraint and dialogue, but stopped short of pressing for an independent investigation. That hesitation did not go unnoticed in Ouagadougou. State media there quickly pointed out the contrast. America often speaks loudly about human rights, but in this case, its voice was faint. France's position was even clearer. Paris stood by Côte d'Ivoire's explanation, repeating the suicide account. But for many Africans, that only reinforced suspicions of outside influence. Across Burkina Faso radio waves, callers said, "If Paris accepts the story, it must have written it." Meanwhile, African institutions struggled. The African Union has the authority to investigate such cases, but weeks passed without a firm statement. For many in Burkina Faso, this silence proved once again that Africa's destiny cannot be left in the hands of distant committees. For the United States, the stakes go beyond values. West Africa supplies cocoa, gold, and other commodities vital to global trade. Instability here also shapes migration flows. If economic conditions collapse in Burkina Faso or Côte d'Ivoire, tens of thousands of young people may look north toward Europe. That would pressure America's European allies and raise new questions for U.S. foreign policy. Security experts warn of another risk. Extremist groups operating in the Sahel thrive when states are distracted or divided. A deepening rift between Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire could create new openings for militants, undoing years of counterterrorism efforts supported by the U.S. and its partners. And so, in Washington, some quietly admit that the death of one activist could ripple outward in unexpected ways, shaping trade, migration, and even security interests. The question now facing America and the world is stark. Will they treat Alino Faso's death as a local dispute, or recognize it as a spark that could redraw the balance of power across an entire region? The story of Alino Faso is more than the story of one man. It is the story of how a single voice, silenced in a foreign cell, can awaken a nation's conscience. His coffin, heavy with unanswered questions, has become a symbol carried on the shoulders of ordinary citizens. From mothers in Ouagadougou to students in Niamey, from artists in Bobo-Dioulasso to workers in Abidjan who whisper in private. For Burkina Faso, his death has already changed the course of politics. A new National Day of Remembrance will ensure that July 24th is never forgotten. A monument will rise in his honor. And in classrooms, children will learn that Alino's only crime was believing too deeply in his country's freedom. For West Africa, the consequences are still unfolding. Will relations between Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire collapse entirely? Will trade, diplomacy, and security cooperation grind to a halt? Or will regional leaders find a way to step back from the edge and allow an independent investigation? For the world, the implications are sobering. When young Africans lose faith in justice at home, many turn north, toward perilous journeys across the desert and the sea. When governments suppress voices instead of listening to them, instability spreads, crossing borders more easily than any refugee. And yet, amid the grief, there is also hope. Hope that Alino's death might serve as a turning point. Hope that African governments will realize that silencing critics only deepens divisions. Hope that the global community will recognize the urgency of supporting sovereignty built on justice, not on silence. Looking ahead, the next 3 to 6 months will be decisive. If the autopsy in Ouagadougou reveals evidence contradicting the suicide claim, international pressure on Côte d'Ivoire will intensify. If Abidjan refuses to engage, Burkina Faso may move to sever ties entirely, reshaping alliances across the Sahel. And if anger continues to swell unchecked, the risk of border clashes cannot be dismissed. The legacy of Alino Faso is still being written. Will he be remembered as a lone activist who died in silence, or as the man whose death lit a fire strong enough to awaken a continent? As one elder in Ouagadougou said during the funeral, "They buried his body, but they did not bury his voice." And so, the voice of Alino lives on, in the chants of protesters, in the decisions of leaders, and in the questions we must all ask. What is justice worth, and who among us will stand to defend it?